Hi, welcome to this third presentation about the project Zo Zijn Wij. My name is Tanja Ahlin and I am an anthropologist and science and technology studies scholar, and I'm currently a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. I'm involved in this project as a researcher, and I'm working together with Anja Ginninga on a literature review that I will present in the coming minutes. The paper that I'm going to talk about builds on the outcomes of an earlier project on elderly deaf and hard of hearing people and on the youth project that is currently underway. In a nutshell, our work is focusing on how various technologies influence how deaf and hard of hearing people, especially children and young adults, relate to themselves and those around them. The aim of doing such a review, of studying literature in great depth, is to discover new and interesting directions for future research. With this review, we're trying to find out which orientations have been left neglected or relatively unexplored, and what dominant orientations have been used at the cost of other orientations that we are now suggesting to be further explored. Information and communication technologies, or ICTs, such as smartphones, laptops, and the internet, tend to be regarded as tools that people use to exchange information with each other. As such, ICTs have been celebrated as a means to achieve better sharing of knowledge and political participation, especially among minorities and oppressed members of societies. Think of the role that smartphones played in supporting protests from Hong Kong to Russia. The view that technologies are merely a tool has also been applied to technologies developed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing people, namely the cochlear implant, or CI. In our paper, we argue that such an instrumental view of technologies glosses over the subtle impact that these devices have on how people relate to each other. Today, communication technologies form an important part of people's lives, and looking at them as only passive tools doesn't really do justice to what it means to be together as a community. What is interesting is the idea that not only people, but also objects, such as technological devices, may take part in how people relate to each other, and through that, how people think of who they are. So, based on whether deaf and hard of hearing people choose to use hearing aids or not use them at all, they may identify themselves as culturally deaf, culturally hearing, or as having a bicultural identity. And they even switch between these identities and communities. As people can tweak with technologies such as CI, these devices contribute to making the overdetermined boundary between deaf and hearing worlds considerably porous. In our paper, we therefore argue that technologies actively shape how people relate to each other, and thereby they also shape people's personal identities. We focus on technologies that support communication of deaf and hard of hearing people with each other and with hearing people, so the CI and everyday ICTs such as text messages, social media, and video calling. We emphasize ethnographic research and highlight the growing fields of deaf studies, as well as what Michelle Friedner and Annelies Kusters have termed deaf anthropology. For years, deaf communities have battled for a broader understanding of deafness, yet the popular academic and medical professional discourses around the world generally still portray deafness as a disability, which may be efficiently treated with cochlear implementation. Through Facebook groups and pages, and via video clips which show deaf and hard of hearing people's reaction after being implanted and thereby receiving the gift of sound, CI is propagated as a miracle technology also online. However, not all deaf and hard of hearing people accept CI with open arms. Some perceive CI as a threat to sign language and deaf residential schools. It is certainly becoming increasingly clear that the possibility of some kind of hearing with CI has significant implications for education, preferred ways of communication, and identification. The CI doesn't fix deafness, but it complicates the divide between deaf and hearing. But how do people with CI relate to sign and spoken languages and to other people with different levels of hearing? One study showed that mothers perceive their deaf and hard of hearing children with CI as both hearing and deaf at the same time. This shows that CI interferes with how deaf and hard of hearing people are seen and how the deaf and hearing relate to each other. And this is especially important for young people's experience of feeling that they belong or don't belong to the deaf community or hearing community or both. Questions such as who you are and to whom do you belong are particularly poignant in adolescence, as this is the time when individuals experience changes on many levels, including developing their identity as independent young adults. For deaf and hard of hearing adolescents, this period may involve a transition shock, as they increasingly learn to cope with living in the mainstream hearing world on their own. Young people with CI may be successful in regular school system, but may still experience great difficulties in relating to their peers. Despite having CI, deaf and hard of hearing children and adolescents have problems with initiating, entering, and maintaining social interaction with hearing peers, especially in groups. Deaf and hard of hearing adolescents with CI are a very diverse group, and they may go from hearing to hard of hearing to deaf identity, with varying intensities according to different situations through their tweaking of CI. But if deaf and hard of hearing adolescents choose sign language, hearing people, such as their speech therapists, may see this as a failed transition into the hearing world. On the other hand, their successful transition into the hearing world may be read as a failure by the deaf community. Such polarization of the deaf and the hearing could be challenged by supporting bicultural education and identity. Yet, in educational and medical settings, both having a CI and using sign language is usually not considered as a desired trajectory for implanted children. Beyond the CI technology, other technologies support sharing of information as well as community participation. ICTs have been increasingly adopted by deaf and hard of hearing people of all ages. Just like hearing people, deaf and hard of hearing people use a number of different types of ICTs, and they switch between them according to different purposes. At the turn of the millennium, the SMS or short text message service impacted on deaf and hard of hearing people in a similar way as the telephone revolutionized the communication of hearing people. Two American authors even describe SMS as the first communication technology that has broken the barriers between deaf and hearing individuals. The SMS technology made it easier for deaf and hard of hearing teenagers to establish friendships on the basis of personal preference rather than hearing status. A researcher from Norway noted that for deaf and hard of hearing teenagers, SMS can open doors and make it easier to be included in social events. With the expansion of the internet and various social media platforms, deaf and hard of hearing people have much more opportunities for making and keeping in contact with people outside of their immediate geographic environment. As they minimize communication challenges, ICTs enhance collaboration and community building for deaf and hard of hearing students. As a result, these technologies help to improve deaf and hard of hearing students' in-class participation and performance. But the main value of social media is that they support deaf and hard of hearing students in forming relations with other students, deaf or not. As one article that we found noted, text and video-based technologies afford deaf and hard of hearing students easier access to interact with peers, thereby increasing their sense of community and belonging. ICTs are particularly important to strengthen the bonds between deaf and hard of hearing people through video calls and sharing videos on social media. In Poland, deaf people combined YouTube as a tool that allows communication through sign language with Facebook as a site where videos and messages can be distributed and shared. According to one researcher, Facebook had a particularly significant impact on the Polish deaf community. On the one hand, this platform contributed to the communication disintegration, as each fraction could create its own Facebook group. On the other hand, Facebook intensified the bonds between those with similar ideologies, as it enabled them to easily organize offline gatherings, including for social activism. Facebook has had a similarly strong impact on deaf college students in the US. There, interacting through Facebook daily allowed the students to relate with multiple communities, and in the process, they learned more about their own families, social norms, current events, and perspectives on various social issues. As one researcher noted, such learning is key for social participation and productive citizenship. However, deaf and hard of hearing people may also struggle with the use of ICTs. The difficulty of having the appropriate skills to use ICTs may be a barrier especially for older deaf and hard of hearing people, but also for youngsters, for example through lack of captions, for spoken content in videos that are shared online. As this feature is underdeveloped, deaf and hard of hearing people also experience difficulties in creating captions for their own videos in sign language, through which they wish to reach hearing people. Additionally, since email, social media, and so on rely heavily on text, they require great skillfulness in reading and writing. Although the internet has been hailed as the technology that helps to diminish inequalities among people, the inequalities that exist offline are often reproduced online. On the internet, deaf and hard of hearing people may reach some sort of equality with hearing people by hiding their hearing status. Yet, if they share that they are deaf, this tends to result into similar discrimination that occurs offline. One researcher suggested the term cyber-autism to describe how hearing people on social media discriminate and even attack deaf and hard of hearing people as inferior due to their inability to hear. For young deaf and hard of hearing people, such cyberbullying may have negative and even tragic consequences. So, although personal computers have generally had a positive influence on the number and quality of friendships for deaf and hard of hearing adolescents, the reliance on online relationships should not be exclusive. Rather, a combination of online and offline friendships seems to work best. So, to conclude, the literature that we have reviewed shows that technologies are not to be taken lightly. As their users, we need to be aware that technologies are more than just tools. Instead, they shape how people relate to each other and to various communities. Deaf and hard of hearing people are not an exception in this. While ICTs have opened new possibilities for them to communicate across social and geographic distance with other deaf and hard of hearing people and with hearing people, there's still much that could be done to make ICTs serve deaf community better. Including deaf and hard of hearing people in the design process of applications and ICT features, such as improvements for creating video captions, would mean that technologies are grounded in deaf and hard of hearing people's needs. This would be a more socially inclusive approach than requiring deaf and hard of hearing people to adjust to the existing technology, which is only marginally useful to them. Ethnographic research could certainly help in this process. Ethnography is a central method in anthropology, and it involves observation and interviewing people to understand all the complexities of their lives. In this research project, Zo Zijn Wij, these methods have been used to learn about the life experiences of deaf and hard of hearing youth. More such research is important to help understand the needs of deaf and hard of hearing people, also in relation to technologies. Other areas where ethnography could be useful include exploring how the transition to adulthood is complicated by the systematic introduction of CI, as well as how deaf and hard of hearing people may use strategies like humor to cope with situations such as cyberbullying. Furthermore, how can social media support young deaf and hard of hearing people in their artistic expression, for example through creating video content and spreading information about events such as deaf poetry slams and other artistic performances? Visual and autoethnographic methods would be particularly useful to discover more on how technologies shape deaf and hard of hearing people's relationships to themselves and to those around them. And these methods would also make deaf and hard of hearing people better included in the research process itself. Thank you for listening. I am looking forward to your questions.